What has formed the millennial ideologue of today, the social justice warrior, the person who has kind of lost that sense of curiosity and wanting to understand and wanting to give the benefit of the doubt? What made them so calcified and so kind of sure and certain? Well, I'm going to go through a bunch of factors that are just based on my observations and kind of the context of millennials that I think formed their identity in politics. And it's not just the typical conversation that you hear where we're brainwashed. It's actually going to be about the true emotional kind of factoring that happens. Because I think most things, when people form a really strong belief, it does come down to emotions, triggers, traumas, because those are what we can most be controlled by. And so that's what really forms a belief and belief system. And so when I was in high school, when millennials are in high school, it was still very much the religious right were the arch enemy of gay rights, because they were saying no gay marriage, and they were saying that gayness was a sin. And this was the reality of the time. And the thing about it is we still didn't have gay marriage, so it was still a conversation. Like people, I remember, used to do debates on why have gay marriage, why not. And so it was, you know, at speech meets and debate meets, that was not a given, so to speak. And so the people who grew up in this time who were gay absolutely had extreme fear, shame, and a lot of them were out, and a lot of them were in the closet, not out. There was not as much of pride. You know, pride came along later, and that the reason it's called pride is because it was a hard emotion to access when you had a gay identity. And so at navigating that time, that's your first exposure to the Republicans, the right-leaning people. Well, they were against you having the right to have your actual sovereignty, to be a being that chose who you were going to marry, who you were going to partner with. So, of course, they are absolutely an enemy. It completely makes sense. And not only that, there was true hate crimes against gays, right? So when we were all growing up, this was the culture. I mean, when Brokeback Mountain came out, that was also a huge, big deal to even have that kind of masculine cowboy stereotype, but then reverted and have it be in a gay romance. That was really a huge, like, people were really excited about that, and then people were really mad about that. That was the polarizing debate of the day, were those types of issues. And so what makes an ideologue is, well, that's your emotional trigger, and that's the school bully, was the religious right. And religious people in general were, at that time, I always associated religious people as enemies as well, because they were so didactic, they were so morally superior, and they were always lecturing and having their rules be the ultimate truth, and they were pushing them on society. And so it's interesting is the formation of an ideologue is actually being in an environment with a religious ideologue who was trying to usurp and be, against your own sovereignty and rights and your right to have a partner. So the leftists thought, okay, the forming leftists, that they're exposed to this authority who is always using the morality as the reasoning for why, you're not allowed to do X, Y, Z. So we get into a kind of classic, that formation, how that saying of, abuse begets abuse and hurt people. Sometimes people who have that abusive parent or abusive authority figure, then when they transition into adulthood, it's creepy how they actually then become that abuser. They have seen that so much, and that was such a powerful, scary enemy that was in their, in their life, entrenching on them. And so what's fascinating to me is I think that the leftist ideologues actually are very much imitative of the right-wing ideologues, and they have taken on that moral superiority and that certainty and that lecturing and telling people they have to do X, Y, Z. It's very similar to religious right ideologues, right? And that's why I don't like ideologues on either side. I don't like ideologues. I don't like collectivists. I'm very much centered on how can we have individual rights and individual sovereignty and free speech and have that amount of to each their own all around. Anyway, so that's the context I think that has formed the left as they're in high school. But then they go into college. And the first thing that is really emphasized in college is really that there's, at least when I went to college, I really got a heavy dose of colonialism and imperialism and always seeing the world as bad white man oppressors versus other races, whether it's indigenous people, whether it's England coming into India, and all of the narratives, they all had that same theme that was really pushed in, which is white man bad. And then I should also say that growing up in the 2000s, the only thing I remember from history as well was we only learned about, really focused on civil war and slavery and racism is bad. That was the main focus. And then the other, and it's a great focus, but I'm just kind of saying this is our context. This is, compared to Generation X and maybe compared to Generation Z, each generation kind of has a new kind of mix of ideology mixed with what they're focusing on in historical context. And so our emphasis was the typical imperialism, colonialism, racism, and so we had that and the white man bad, and that was kind of just the given, that was considered. That was our framing of how we were learned to have a lens for the world, was this kind of victim and oppression kind of element. And another thing we learned about, of course, was Hitler. And of course, Hitler is taught, but we do not learn as much about the Soviet Union and you don't learn about the kulaks. You don't learn about the gulag. I mean, you truly are not exposed to it. I only learned about that from my exposure to reading Ayn Rand, who escaped that world and wrote fictional books. I only had that glimmer of understanding that aspect of history that was actually left out. And so what's key is there's certain things that are emphasized, right? And then there are certain things that are completely omitted. And so our lens is formed by, if we had that direction of this is the focus and this is who's the bad guy in this situation, then that's what becomes our kind of belief system, because it's like, well, that's what I've been exposed to and that's what I know. And then you keep having situations come up in your life that you'll see, oh, this affirms this existing lens. And if you're never exposed, if certain things are omitted by that omission actually is the best way to control a mind, because you just don't know other aspects. Like the reason I want to also emphasize about how the Soviet Union and communism and that level of history was not emphasized is because that's why leftists and the leftist ideologues of today really they had no exposure to socialism or communism and any of that history, other than that phrase of like, oh, well, men are just it's too bad that men are too corrupt to do it well. They kind of act like, they kind of had that idea that if Marxism, it fails, it's good in theory, but fails in practice, which is actually I like how Jordan Peterson says it's just such a conceited statement, because it's saying that you little millennial will be, if you ran a Marxist system, that you would be so morally pure and have integrity that wouldn't go that way. And he makes the point that, you have to have quite an ego to fancy yourself that you won't fall into that corruption of how, because that system in itself and what it does to human nature is why it ends in this level of just massacre. But let's not get into I'm just saying, so millennials, they have they have the emotional trigger of the religious right is the bad guy from an age when that's really, they're forming their identity, they're forming, and whether they were, even if you're not gay, you sympathized with gay people who were going through this, you saw the religious right as the villain. And then of course your history is focused on white man bad, racism, sexism, and no Soviet Union, that's omitted, but definitely Hitler. And then as millennials navigated the world, then they went through so much disempowerment in their job force that they started to look for a reason for why that was. When in fact, as with most complex things, there were really multiple variables. Instead, they just thought, well, it's white man bad. It's this same group of suits, like the kind of idea of Republicans as being those evil suits. It's them, it's men, it's capitalism, because they've never been exposed to something that kind of even went through economy. You never learn about the economy, and you never learn about Soviet Union. So they have all these kind of terms, and then they've had this constant victim versus oppressor narratives in several forms. And so those ways they learned in school and that emotional wound then led them into the lens of, this is how I'm going to feel about the recession, and this is how I'm going to feel about me navigating relationships and work problems. I'm going to see that men are bad, white men are bad, white Republican men are ahead of the companies, and capitalism is bad, and white bankers. It starts to form this kind of, this is the loose narrative. I mean, this is the thing that I would say I held in me as a default kind of narrative. I mean, because I had read Ayn Rand early, I had a whole other take, because that gets in your brain as a different kind of worm. Well, some people would call it a worm. I would call it a tree from the knowledge of good and evil. But fruit, I mean, not just, but the whole tree, I'd say. And so so millennials now have gotten to the point, as we've gotten into what we're in now, which is the year 2021. Now we've been in such a system, we've had the disillusionment and disenchantment of feeling disempowered on so many levels for so long, that now we've got the ideologue, in order to start to become the intense kind of on the evil side, they've got to have a level of resentment. They can't have that green optimism that they had in their 20s, where they're learning about imperialism and it's kind of just a distant, foggy thing, and it's fine. They've got to have gone through probably 10 years to develop this real chip on your shoulder, this calcified wound that started in high school because of the, you have a whole, people, the way that they process their life is through this kind of narrative of who slighted them and who are the bad guys, right? And so by the time when you're a social justice warrior, when you're an ideologue, you're really driven by this level of spite and resentment that has calcified because of all these experiences, and you have identified the enemy and the scapegoat as X. And so these are the factors that I think led to, there's many other factors, but I think that this was just kind of my way of exploring an opinion that I've been kind of processing, and by saying it out loud, I kind of wrangle with it and figure out, okay, I'm processing this out loud and I'm sharing it as an insight, and maybe it resonates, maybe it doesn't.